So back in the summer of 2016, Mike Pence was the governor of Indiana. This was, he was running for vice president, and but he was the governor of Indiana. And of all the strange things to happen, he signed a law. This was called in Indiana. It was called House Enrolled Act 1337, an act to amend the Indiana Code concerning health that required that all abortions and miscarriages have a funeral. Not making this up. It got struck down by the courts. But it required that all abortions and miscarriages, and for a while, the hospitals anyway, and abortion clinics were having to comply with it. And it required them to have a funeral. It made abortions very, very expensive because, you've got a little bit of blood and tissue here, and now we've got to take it to a funeral director and organize a funeral or a cremation at the very least. It required cremation or a funeral. And this then caused women across Indiana, the question was, of course, given particularly that between 20 and 50% of all, I've seen numbers as high as 50%. I think the generally accepted numbers around 20% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage. That how are you going to know? How are you going to know when women have miscarriages? Because most miscarriages, the vast majority of them are at home, and they're in the first month or two. And in fact, there are scientists who suggest that as many as half of all pregnancies or half of all fertilized eggs never implant, which is and just become the next menstrual period, which could arguably become a miscarriage as well. So how do you know? And so there was this talk about how is Mike Pence going to enforce this here in Indiana, before the courts stopped the law. And there was talk about creating a registry, a statewide registry, where women would check in every month and say, okay, my period was on April 5th, so don't hassle me until May 5th, and I'll tell you if my period comes again on May 5th. And out of that came this movement, Periods for Pence, where women all across the state started, it started on Twitter and Facebook. And they started tweeting or Facebooking to Mike Pence saying, well, my period just started. You can check me off the list for this month. And, it started out as kind of a lighthearted thing, but then some people took this very, very seriously. The Federalist, for example, one of the publications of the hard right funded by right-wing billionaires, ran an article on November 14th, 2016, at the height of Periods for Pence, titled, "Sending Menstrual Blood to Mike Pence is a Stupid Protest That Hurts Women." And then it goes, "It's beyond me why the left fears that a man who very obviously loves lots of sex with lots of women wants to ban the birth control and make such quack, 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 right? Let's put some spin on this. This is unfair and it's not right." And some woman actually sent apparently a tampon or a pad to Mike Pence's office, and it just created, oh my God, it's bio-waste, it's coming to us. And the conservatives were just furious. Furious, I'm telling you. But generally speaking, NPR did a whole special on it in November of 2016. And generally speaking, it was treated kind of lighthearted, like, Pence isn't really going to do this. Come on. A funeral for a miscarriage? But it did make it to law. It passed the House and Senate and got signed by the governor. What's next? Now that the clock is turning back to 1950. When I was born, abortion was very illegal. On the other hand, any woman who had the money, and that's always the key, right? Any woman who had the money could go to a doctor and say, I'm having terrible menstrual cramps, wink, wink, and I think I need to have a D&C. I need to have my uterus opened up and scraped out, basically, or vacuumed out, and just get rid of all the tissue that's in there that is causing my cramps. And the doctor would wink, wink, say, okay, fine, I'll refer you to an obstetrician. And the woman would go to the, I know 2 women who did this. Or I knew. I mean, this was 50 years ago. More than 50 years ago. It was when I was in high school. I knew 2 girls who did this, who got abortions when it was illegal. But now they don't, and they used to teach this in medical school. Now, by and large, they don't even teach it in medical school any longer. And now this whole movement has gotten very, very serious about this. And so now, instead of having, health insurance, because health insurance would pay for it back in the day, a D&C, no big deal. It's a procedure. It's not that expensive. It's, But that's no longer the case anymore. And so now, instead of a woman going to her doctor and saying, I need a D&C because I'm having pain or bloating or whatever, now it's going to be, I need to go to Canada or Mexico, the 2 countries that share a border with the United States, where abortion is fully legal in both countries. In fact, in Canada, abortion is legal at all stages of pregnancy. It's entirely between the woman and her doctor. Well, it's ultimately entirely up to the woman. And in Canada, Canadian Medicare, they have Medicare for all. Every single person in Canada has Medicare, regardless of their age. And Medicare pays for it. No questions asked. 100% paid for. Which raises an interesting question. Are the Canadians and the Mexicans going to start building walls to keep out American women? I mean, it's like, where does this all go? Now, again, I realize I'm engaging in a little bit of hyperbole here to make my point. But it wasn't hyperbole when Mike Pence wanted to track every woman in Indiana and make sure that any miscarriage was turned into a funeral. That was deadly serious. And I don't think it's hyperbole, and I don't think anybody has called specifically about this. But, when I came in this morning, we were talking about this, and Nate said, this is, because Sean and I were talking about, they're going to overturn Obergefell, the gay marriage law, or the gay marriage Supreme Court ruling. And, and birth control might be next. And Nate's comment was, hey, what about Lawrence v. Texas? I mean, their comment, Nate's comment was, that decriminalized gay men having sex. Is that next? Well, of course that's next. That was another example of the Supreme Court essentially making law, which is, according to the Constitution, the job of Congress. And that's the rationale of this decision written by Sam Alito. I mean, some of these guys are so extreme. For example, Neil Gorsuch believes, whose mother, ran the Environmental Protection Agency under Ronald Reagan, and ran it into the ground so badly after 3 years on the job, she had to resign in disgrace. Ann Gorsuch was a disaster for this country. And I don't think very many people disagree with me on that. And so her son, who is now in the Supreme Court, is saying, the EPA is regulating arsenic. In the regulation that said that the EPA could regulate toxic substances, they did not specify arsenic. So the EPA cannot regulate arsenic. The EPA is regulating carbon dioxide. The EPA is trying to, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, he's basically saying that unless Congress specifically tells a regulatory agency exactly what they may and may not regulate, it can't be regulated, which would end basically all the functions of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the USDA. It would kill them all, which is, of course, the the late David Koch's wet dream. I mean, this is what he wanted. He campaigned for president in 1980, running for president on ending all the regulatory agencies because the Constitution doesn't give him that kind of power. We want a libertarian country. I'm telling you, this is not the end, this is the beginning. There's a lot of Sturm und Drang right now in the media, and appropriately so, about this is the end of abortion rights in the United States. But I'm telling you, this is also going to be, very shortly, particularly if you end up with Republicans controlling the House of Representatives, Republicans controlling the Senate, and in 2024, a Republican controlling the White House, we will be doing what Vladimir Putin did in Russia and what Viktor Orban did in Hungary. Everything's going to be on the table. Gay rights will be on the table. LGBTQ rights, excuse me. Gay marriage will be on the table. Birth control will be on the table. Interracial marriage will be on the table. These are all decisions that were made by the Supreme Court in the absence of federal legislation. And that's the MacGuffin, that's the hook, that's the fulcrum, the pivot point on which Alito's decision teeter-totters, on which it stands, is that it's not in the Constitution, and it was not made into a law, and therefore we're going to leave it up to the states. It's an unenumerated right. The 10th Amendment says the states are responsible for those things. And of course, none of that considers the fact that now you've got Republicans talking about, well, let's pass federal laws to ban abortion everywhere, including California.